kiddo. There are some people who will tell you that if you don't breed snakes, then you don't get to comment on what is going on in the breeding world. And to those people, I say, watch me. Hey guys, welcome back. I'm John. This is Butts. And before we get into the meat of today's episode, and I promise this is going to be an episode, I need to express some very serious gratitude to all of you. The way this community and the world came together for Brian Barczyk was absolutely incredible. Seeing my feed absolutely filled with tribute videos to Brian, from big creators to people with just a dozen subscribers, was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. I'm not going to do another video on that topic because it's very difficult to do videos like that. But one of the things that it did was cause Brian to become trending, which in turn caused major news corporations and major publications to pick up the story. It was incredible. On top of that, I made a community post explaining why I haven't been uploading as regularly and consistently and how I need to work through some things. And the outpouring of love and support from you guys absolutely floored me. I mean that from the bottom of my heart. That really touched me. I think we have one of the best communities right here, and I am so very grateful for that. There are also two people that I need to specifically thank personally. And those people are Scott and Pepper Lee. They've both been regulars on the channel since darn near the beginning, and both made very generous donations to the channel through the Buy Me a Coffee page that I have listed below. And that also floored me. So I ended up paying that forward and donating half of that to the Legacy Aquarium through Adam's initiative, Wiccan's Wicked Reptiles, the initiative to put together enough funds to buy a plaque that will go on to the Legacy Aquarium, all funds going to the Legacy Aquarium. I wouldn't have been able to do that without the support of you guys. I can't remember exactly what we decided on writing on that plaque. For those of you who were in the live stream, maybe you can comment down below and remind us all what's actually going on that plaque. So my donation wouldn't have been possible without their donations and without all of you. We just hit 4,000 subscribers, guys. It's crazy. It's humbling. So just know if you weren't able to donate to Adam's live stream, that's from all of us, because it wouldn't be possible without you. So if you do get the chance to visit the Legacy and you see the plaque that Adam put together, you can look at that, you can touch it, and you can be like, I was a part of that. That's from me as well, you know. Okay, let's dive into today's topic. There's something that happens regularly in the breeding community, something that's kept in the shadows, and it gets very little to no attention. Anytime this topic is brought up, the reaction is either shock and disbelief for the people who didn't know this was happening, or for the people that did know it was happening, the reaction is, it's unfortunate and it happens more than you know. It's a topic that came up in a handful of videos about 3-4 years ago, and they all came out around the same time. But it seems to be something that's been kind of brushed aside by a lot of people. It's something that people don't want to talk about, but it's something we need to talk about. It's a topic that I find very upsetting, but I'm going to do my best to handle this gently. So don't confuse my calmness and hopefully rationale in discussing this topic to mean that it doesn't royally infuriate me. But we got to have some tact when we discuss this. When you hear these things, your rage does not outweigh my own, I promise you. But because I want the breeders who watch this and who are practicing this to take what I put in this video into consideration, I need to handle it gently. If I come in here on the attack, the only good that will come out of this is creating an echo chamber that makes us feel better for venting, but will probably be outrightly dismissed by those who actually need to hear it. And that topic is reptile breeders using a freezer to call animals that they have bred that either aren't selling, don't have the target gene combo, or have life-threatening abnormalities. I think it's obvious, or should be obvious, that only one of those things is morally acceptable and even necessary at times when it comes to euthanizing an animal. We'll get into that all in a moment. This topic is like an onion. It has many layers to it, and I want to give each one as much due diligence as I can. So the reason we're tackling this topic today is because last week there was a post made by Darian Drollinger, owner of Dubia and Morph Market, who we all know. A lot of people have different opinions on Darian, but I think he's doing a good job. He's rocking the boat, and the boat needs to be rocked. I like the guy. And the post had something to do with the auctions that are new to Morph Market. And there was a conversation that came up about breeders and surplus animals. And as many of you already know, Robert McPhee, owner of Bob's Boas, had a very strong and controversial opinion on what should be done with surplus animals, which I will show you in a second. Before I go any further on this, I need to mention that I reached out to Bob personally. We spoke respectfully, and we had a good conversation, respectful on both sides. And I also spoke briefly with Darian and several others about this topic before deciding where I wanted to go with this video. Okay, now, so that everything is out there and we all know where we're coming from, I'm going to read a couple of comment threads with Bob, and then I'm going to share parts of our conversation and give you my opinion kind of as we go. There are definitely inconsistencies in some of the things that are said, so take those things as you will. Here's the original comment from Bob that sparked all of this. So I believe this comment was in regard to the market being down. I only have the screenshots. The post itself was later deleted, so I wasn't able to go back and get the full information here, but I do have a lot of information here. So Bob says, I already offered a quick solution. Reduce the surplus fixes everything. But most people can't accept and actually make the commitment. Darian says, reduce the surplus? ? Bob says, yes, reduce the surplus without selling. Do I need to spell it out? In more blunt terms, put them in the freezer. I'm sure I'll catch poop for that comment, but it is what it is. If it hasn't sold yet, it won't. Selling below market value through auctions or any other ways only serves to extend the duration of the poopy market we are currently in. Cheap reptiles will always be considered throwaway pets. Bothered me too, a lot. I thought that was not great. He later edited the comment to add at the end of it, I'd like to add 25% of the boa surplus could be eliminated just by calling off sick and or weak, non-thriving babies that are currently being sold to uneducated newcomers to the industry. And then he later posted claiming that Darian edited his original comment, and then a little while later admitted to having edited the comment because it was pretty easy to see that it was an edited comment simply by clicking on View Edit History. Anyway, that whole thing was a big poop show. In another conversation, he seemed to be encouraging others to euthanize their sick snakes, or snakes they didn't want, by putting them in a freezer as well. I believe this is in regard to whether or not he accepts returns. Bob says, unfortunately, too much risk involved. I'll tell them to put the one they have in the freezer, or give it to someone, and I'll give them a discount on the next one. Jessica replies, the freezer? Bob replies, yep, I have almost 300 boas. I'm not going to risk their health for buyer's remorse. Sorry, not sorry. Jessica says, so you'll let them kill an animal you sent them, and you're willing to send another animal? I think a simple no would have sufficed. Here's another place where he is called out and doubles down again. They're calling him out for, killing the animals because the economy is bad and saying that's ridiculous. Bob says, get over yourself, bro. At some point when I feed off 1,000 or more a month in rodents and pay to house and heat my animals, it has to be about money. You are fooling yourself if you think it's not. Come on, Bob. Ryan replies, but that's all it is. Hang it up, people. Buy pets for their love of animals. You're no different than a puppy mill. If you can no longer make a living without killing animals because you're losing money, then peace out of the business. This is gross. That was horribly written, but I think I agree with it. And Bob says, who cares? Blah, blah, blah. You know what to do. Oh yeah, I already did. Sounds like an Eminem song. LOL. Hope you have a better night. Maybe you can go find a safe place where someone can tell you that you are special in your very own way. So Bob's response in the heat of the moment is to just mock the people, calling him out for saying some really gross things. If all of this makes you angry, you're in the right company. It makes me angry too. I spent a few days thinking about how I wanted to approach this subject, and in that time I saw more threads about it. One of those Bob was in again, this time defending himself and possibly backpedaling a little bit. He says, I didn't say I freeze kill anything. Just because they end up in the freezer doesn't mean that's how they're euthanized. Two methods I use for culling are slow cool down, then CO2 gas, and piercing the brain, pithing. After some time, Bob came back to the thread and waved the white flag, saying this. Well, I'm done for now. Death threats all night long, and animal control just left here because of anonymous reports of Freeze killing dozens of boas. Passed with flying colors, nothing to report, according to the officer. Such a poop thing for a community to do. Apparently, I'm being canceled. 20 years in the industry gone in 24 hours. I'm shocked and dismayed and pissed. Now, I understand why people are upset. It upset me. But I want to say, it doesn't matter how upset you are. Making threats like that is never acceptable. I did reach out to his local animal control agency to verify the rest of that, just for the sake of due diligence. And I want to make clear I was not one of the people who reported him, though the officer that I spoke to had that a little confused when they replied to me. But this was an interesting reply from the officer, the animal control officer, Sergeant Alex, that I will read to you nonetheless. Good evening, Mr. Snyder. I was the officer assigned to investigate your complaint against Mr. McPhee. Again, I didn't make the complaint, but after my investigation and a visit with Mr. McPhee at his home, I found the inflammatory remark he made on the Facebook thread was a flippant response to the heated argument that was occurring there. While at his home, I found no evidence which suggested that Mr. McPhee kills snakes by throwing them into a freezer. Additionally, he did provide me with proof of the humane methods he uses to put down snakes when necessary. Mr. McPhee does have several snakes that he cares for properly. I was allowed to see his entire operation and all of the necessities for the snakes that were being met at the time of my visit. I feel it is important to also mention that while his statements on Facebook seem to indicate that he calls snakes en masse, that is not actually the case. Mr. McPhee told me that he may have 4 or 5 newborn snakes that are born with deformities or sicknesses, which he puts down each year via pithing. While the methods he described in the Facebook thread would be considered improper, my investigation provided no evidence to suggest that he is actually practicing these methods himself. Furthermore, it seems that this entire situation could have been avoided if Mr. McPhee chose not to engage the argument on the Facebook thread and post inflammatory remarks, which he most likely knew would spark outrage and cause dissent among the Facebook group members. I appreciate your concern for the animals and for reaching out to us. If you have any more questions or concerns, feel free to reach out. Sincerely, Sergeant Alex Meisling. So, after marinating on this whole thing, I decided to reach out to Bob and see if he would be interested in answering some questions. To my surprise, he was very accommodating and polite and offered to answer any questions that I had. At the time, Bob, and most people in the comments on those posts were under the impression that CO2 was an acceptable method for euthanizing snakes. We'll get more into that in a moment. So in my conversation with Bob, again, we're both very respectful, and I think that's why there was a conversation at all. But in that conversation, I asked him a handful of questions. The first one, and most important one, was very on the nose. I asked, since he mentioned breeding snakes for over 20 years, if there ever was a time that he used the freezer method, and if so, what caused him to transition out of it. I asked this kind of as a baseline question to see what direction the conversation was going to go. You see, from 1978 to 2004, cooling snakes and then putting them in the freezer was actually considered one of the most acceptable and humane ways to euthanize a reptile at home. And this was from leading veterinary sources that gave this information. So it wasn't until 2005 and later that we started to question that method and do more research into if that was actually a humane way of culling. Because of this, Bob's answer to the question of if he had ever used that method in the past lined up with the timeline and made total sense. This was his reply. Yes, I have used these methods in the past as it was how I was taught from others in the hobby. As people began talking about the possible pain associated with this method, I began changing how I euthanize them in order to maintain the most humane method possible. Many years ago, probably around 2008 or 2009, I began using 2 methods. The first is piercing of the brain or pithing. This method is probably the most humane, but doesn't allow me to utilize or preserve the skull if I want to display it. The second way I euthanize is by slowly cooling the animal down and then using CO2 gas to euthanize. Okay, we'll break this down really quick. He admits he's done it. Again, it wasn't until 2005 that there was even a discussion about it causing pain in the animal. And he said he stopped around 2008. That timeline lines up. And he mentioned 2 other methods that, at the time of the conversation, seemed legitimate to me. You're welcome to believe or disbelieve what he's saying, or if he's just backpedaling or whatever. I'm just putting all the information out there at this point in the video. In a moment, we're going to get into the reasons for calling, what I believe is acceptable, what is not, and also discuss what methods, because there are many, are considered ethical and humane with the knowledge that we have right now in 2024. The remainder of our conversation just covered what I would later learn from Sergeant Alexander anyway. And both of those stories, they corroborated each other. They both lined up. I ended up giving Bob some resources that he said he would look into. And before we get off the topic of Bob specifically, I want to read you some parts of his overall feelings about the whole thing and kind of how we ended the conversation. So Bob said, "I believe this is a very important discussion that needs to be had for the betterment of the entire industry. I believe that is our job as breeders to call out every deleterious gene that we are able to recognize before these animals reach market. I strongly stand by my statement that upwards of 25% of Boas available would not meet my standards to be sold and allowed to pass their genetics. I applaud you for thinking about this and hopefully beginning a thoughtful discussion. If me being canceled for my comment is what was needed to create a conversation about this topic, I believe it is worth it. I can assure you that I have zero malice in my heart towards the people in this hobby, the hobby, or the animals that make up this hobby. I look forward to seeing us grow as a community." Okay, so whatever your thoughts on that, let's leave the Bob topic behind for a moment and let's discuss when it is ethical and necessary to call an animal and when it's not. I think one of the main problems in regard to this topic is that the primary source of income from these large breeders doesn't come from the pet keeper side of the industry. The majority of sales I imagine to be breeders selling to other breeders for their own projects. There are a lot of people breeding, trying to hit that next big gene combo. So what happens to all the normals, all the classics, all the animals without a color morph? Well, a lot of times they can be sold wholesale. Sometimes they go to pet stores, and sometimes they're euthanized. Now, I will not say that every time a healthy snake is euthanized that it's unethical, which might be controversial in itself. But I say that because there are several ophiophagic species of snakes that eat other snakes, such as king cobras, musaranas, indigo snakes, obviously king snakes. So in that sense, it's really not that different than euthanizing a mouse or a rat, humanely, a healthy mouse or rat to feed to a pet snake. However, I do believe the market for that is small enough, and the number of stillborn snakes and snakes born with life-threatening deformities is high enough to sustain that demand without having to kill healthy snakes. So for that reason, I think the argument of, well, a king cobra has to eat too, kind of falls through, at least a little bit. I think intention plays a big part in the ethics of when to euthanize. For example, there are many imperfect snakes hatched every year. If the argument for putting those animals down, and right now I'm talking about something with like a slight deformities, something that's not life-threatening and not causing the animal pain. If the argument for putting those down or putting down healthy snakes is that it has to be done because there is a surplus of animals on the market right now and that the only way to sell those animals would be at a discounted price, and your primary concern is that the selling of those animals as less expensive pet-only animals will drive the market price down on the rest of your animals, well, there is really no two ways to put this. For that person, the value of $1 takes precedence over the value of a life. I think it's that black and white. If that is you, maybe you can consider getting into greeting cards or learn to crochet some doilies that you can sell on Etsy and start a business that way, because you've clearly lost sight of the value of life outside of a dollar sign, and you can't run an ethical live animal business without that. Another point on that subject that I feel should be obvious is that if the market is flooded with the animal that you're breeding, ball pythons, for example, there are 45,000 ball pythons on Morph Market right now. If you feel the market is flooded and the only way you can make ends meet is culling off some of what you produce, just produce less. Or start a different project in a market that isn't flooded. That's like common business practice outside of snake breeding. Killing offspring because of surplus isn't adapting as a business owner. It's unethical. These aren't inanimate objects that you produced in your wood shop. It's still a life. You do have the option of selling for cheaper as a pet-only animal. You might take a little longer and you might not get the return you would have liked. You might have to eat some of the electric and food costs for a little while, but that should be budgeted into your plan already as an ethical breeder. So when is it ethical for you to euthanize an animal that you produced? For that, we're going to look to Emily from Snake Discovery, one of my favorite human beings on the planet. So I'm going to show you a few clips, and that will also help us segue into ethical methods for euthanasia. And as you watch this, I want you to keep in mind that this is a video from 4 years ago. And for as wonderful and ethical as Emily is, there is one thing in this video that doesn't quite line up with the current standard from the American Veterinary Medical Association, which is the source, the main source for up-to-date information on this topic. Let's watch.
First, let me state that reptiles are very hardy, resilient animals. They can bounce back from crazy attacks from predators and health issues, and it doesn't faze them one bit. Sometimes reptiles are born with one eye or no eyes at all. They're born with a slight kink in their back, or sometimes when they're older, they're burned by a heat mat or heat lamp, or even attacked by their prey if they're fed live. And those animals can have just as good of a quality of life as perfectly healthy otherwise animals. It's when the health concern causes pain or discomfort to the snake that impacts its quality of life, where you have to decide to end its suffering by humanely euthanizing the animal. Although this baby over here looks completely healthy. It's beautiful too. It's brother or sister, and this one is beautiful too, but if you look at her spine, it has some serious kinks down the spine. And again, sometimes snakes can survive with a slight kink, but the main concern is whether the snake can actually pass food through. And I don't think she'd be able to. What do you think?
These ones are pretty major, but if you look at the back of her body, she's kinked over. Like if you pull her out the leg a little bit,
down here too.
She's completely kinked over. Look at these
bad
crazy
luck
things. That's such a bummer.
It would just be cruel to
even try.
Let her hang on, because she wouldn't pass anything, and she would just suffer. So if the snake were allowed to live, it probably wouldn't live very long, and it would likely just starve to death, and that's no way to go. So the decision has been made to cull this snake. Most of the time, kinks in a snake's spine will happen just randomly. It can also be a sign of inbreeding, but we know that these are not inbred because, well, both parents came from completely different sides of the country, right?
Correct.
So how do you euthanize a snake humanely? Since snakes have such low oxygen level requirements, you can't use the same techniques that you use for like rodents and other animals, because the process takes so much longer for snakes to actually pass away. For example, CO2 chambers are usually used for rodents to euthanize them to feed to snakes. But because of the low oxygen levels snakes need, the process would take so long for the snake to finally run out of oxygen and pass away that it would feel like it's suffocating that entire time before it finally dies. So it is not recommended to use CO2 in order to euthanize snakes, or any reptile for that matter. Another technique people in the past, and currently some people still do this too, is to put sick animals or sick reptiles in the freezer, and they just close the door and check back in a couple of hours and it's passed. This is also not a recommended method because the animal, the reptile, stays conscious during the freezing process, so it feels it when those ice crystals start to form in the tissues of the snake, and that is just about as painful as you can imagine. Another technique is to behead the snake or the reptile, and this is literally what it sounds like. However, without a head, studies have shown that snakes and other reptiles, since they have such a low oxygen level requirement, they stay conscious and can still sense pain for up to an hour after they are beheaded. So that is another technique that we do not recommend using. So how do you do it? I hate to say this because it's kind of gruesome, but crushing the head of the reptile in a quick motion is one way to euthanize because it's instantaneous, along with dipping in liquid nitrogen. That's another instant euthanization, and anything that's fast and quick like that is generally more humane than the longer, prolonged deaths. Since most of us, including myself, don't have the heart to do that to our pets, another option is to, of course, bring your animal to the vet where they can provide a lethal injection, which is another humane way to euthanize any animal, really. Another example of a snake that has an injury but doesn't have to be euthanized is nearly headless Nick, my eyeless garter snake. If you're not familiar with him, he got hit by a lawnmower about a year ago, and it took off one eye, and we had to have his other eye surgically removed because it was swelling up and had a risk of rupturing. But even without any eyes, he tongue flicks, he explores, he eats, he poops, he sheds, he does everything that a normal, healthy garter snake would do, so he has just as good of a quality of life as a healthy garter snake, in our opinion, or close to it, other than not being able to see. He just smells around a little bit more. So that's why we decided not to euthanize that snake in particular.
So in that video, Emily gives us one example of a life-threatening deformity, and then a couple examples of deformities that seem bad but don't require euthanasia. They can be sold as pet-only animals and live happy, healthy lives. She also mentioned 3 types of euthanasia that cause extreme pain over an extended period of time that should not be used, and 3 that can be, but for those 3, really only 2 are actually humane across the board. So Emily not mentioning this one specific thing obviously doesn't make her a bad person in any way. I'm sure if she sees this, she'll agree with the updated terms. And that's what this is all about, learning new things and implementing them. So let's pull up the AVMA guidelines for euthanasia of animals. If you'd like to follow along, there's a link in the description, and this can all be found on pages 92 and 93. This thing is very long and very complete. So AVMA, again, that's the American Veterinary Medical Association, agrees on all the things that Emily mentions in the video, but also gives one important caveat when it comes to freezing, not when it comes to putting them in the freezer. That is 100% unethical and inhumane. But they have one caveat in regard to using liquid nitrogen. And this is what they have to say about freezing and liquid nitrogen. Hypothermia is an inappropriate method of restraint or euthanasia for amphibians and reptiles. It is believed that freezing can result in the formation of ice crystals in tissues that may cause pain. The exception to this is unless animals are sufficiently small, less than 4 grams, to permit immediate and irreversible death if placed in liquid nitrogen, and 2, rapid freezing. So the only time liquid nitrogen is considered a humane method is if the animal is less than 4 grams, which is around 0.1 ounces. So this obviously doesn't apply to many animals at all. For example, baby ball pythons and boas are already usually over 60 grams when they hatch, so this wouldn't be an acceptable method for them at any stage in their life. Less than 4 grams is incredibly small, so that window is for only something around the size of a poison dart frog. Tiny. There's another video by Chris Hartwick on this topic from 4 years ago. Chris is a ball python breeder whose YouTube channel I've learned a lot from. He, like many of the people in the comments of the Bob threads, along with myself, thought intuitively that it would be most humane to use a CO2 chamber to euthanize one of his snakes, but after 2 20 and 30-minute attempts, the snake, because of their low metabolism and low oxygen level requirements, came back to life. He then resorted to beheading, thinking that this would be the quickest and most humane method. Now, none of that was done with malice or intentionally. He was trying to do it as humanely as possible, but just didn't have all the information. So at the end of the day, there are really only 2 humane ways to euthanize a snake, and that is by quickly destroying the brain or by lethal injection. So this is all to show that people don't always get it 100% right 100% of the time, despite their best efforts. There is a lot of old information still floating around out there, some of which was taught for 20 years, like the putting snakes in a freezer thing. Those things don't apply anymore, as we've learned new things and science has progressed. I believe most people have good intentions and are doing their best to keep up with that and to make the changes that they need to make. To circle back to the beginning here, is Bob one of those people? He mentioned having been in the past when he stopped using the freezer method in 2008. He also told me he would happily watch the snake discovery video and read what AVMA had to say about it. The whole purpose of this video and showcasing Bob's experience as an example is to give breeders like Bob an opportunity to pause and maybe go, well, I didn't give it much thought before because I had already been told how it was supposed to be done. But then I came across this video and it made me think, maybe I wasn't doing it the way I was supposed to. Maybe I need to make some changes. So this video is an open invitation for anyone who is practicing those inhumane ways and reasons for culling to get themselves up to date without judgment, so that maybe you can say, yes, I used to do that, I've learned and grown, and that's in the past. Because again, if we are just always on our soapboxes creating an echo chamber and gatekeeping change, we're not actually helping animals. Are we? I feel like sometimes it's just stroking our own egos in a vacuum. Sometimes to actually affect change, we have to bury that initial visceral reaction, have a respectful conversation, and have our sources ready to back up our claims. And then it's up to the other person to be receptive. That part you can't force. One final point before I go. If you're breeding, but you feel like you would be unable to humanely euthanize an animal if you needed to at home, or you feel like you wouldn't be able to afford taking it to a vet to have it put down, you probably shouldn't be breeding. Nobody wants to hear that, and nobody wants to have to deal with that aspect of it. But it's as necessary an aspect to prepare for as regularly providing clean water or picking up poop. Being able to provide quick, humane, and painless death to an animal that will otherwise have an extended and painful death is part of proper husbandry. And if you can't provide that, then you shouldn't do it. So I know this only applies to a select group of people, select group of breeders. Most breeders, I would like to believe, are very ethical people running a very ethical business. So as always, all of my sources will be linked in the description, and I hope this video can become a source in itself. I hope those of you whose breeding operations could do with some updating gain something out of this. If you think this video would be helpful in any way, for the sake of the algorithm, consider hitting the like. It helps get the video around. If you feel moved to share this, it would definitely help with that as well. Thank you guys so much for watching. As always, remember to be kind to yourselves and each other. I appreciate you all, and I will see you on the next one. Bye.